He was young, handsome, and rising fast through the Oklahoma City Police Department. Daniel Holtzclaw had the kind of resume the public was meant to trust. A college athlete, disciplined, clean-cut, the kind of officer who looked good in front of a camera. But beneath the uniform, behind the polite smile, something darker was festering. His power had become a weapon, and his authority a disguise. It began quietly, as it often does. Small encounters, routine stops in poor neighborhoods where few questioned police behavior. Holtzclaw's patrol beat took him through the east side of Oklahoma City, predominantly black, mostly low income. To many residents, the police were a daily presence, but not a comforting one. When Holtzclaw pulled over women at night, there was an air of intimidation that went beyond normal procedure. He asked personal questions. He lingered too long, and then eventually he went too far. The first report was brushed aside. The woman was a felon, recently released, her credibility easy to discredit. She claimed that during a late-night stop, Holtzclaw had forced her to perform a sexual act to avoid arrest. Internal Affairs noted the complaint but didn't prioritize it. After all, Holtzclaw was a model officer, or at least that's how he appeared on paper. Over the next few months, more women came forward, at first quietly and then with growing courage. The pattern was disturbingly consistent. Women stopped under the pretense of broken taillights, expired tags, or minor warrants. They were searched, questioned, humiliated, and then sexually assaulted in secluded areas. Holtzclaw had chosen his victims carefully, women with criminal records, drug addictions, or unstable living situations. People the system had already taught not to speak. But in 2014, one woman refused to be silenced. Janie Ligons, a 57-year-old grandmother, was driving home after playing dominoes with friends when Holtzclaw pulled her over. She had no criminal history, no reason to fear an arrest. What followed was a terrifying ordeal. He searched her, forced her into his car, and assaulted her behind an abandoned school building. When he let her go, she drove straight home and told her daughter what had happened. Unlike his previous victims, Janie went directly to the police. The case that followed would reveal one of the most disturbing abuses of police power in modern American history. Detectives placed Holtzclaw under surveillance. They matched his patrol car's GPS data with victims' accounts. The overlap was undeniable. They pulled his call logs, his duty records, his shift reports, and one by one, every victim's timeline aligned with Holtzclaw's presence. As word spread through the community, more women came forward. 13 victims in total. Each had a story, different details, same horror. The department could no longer ignore it. Holtzclaw was arrested in June 2014. When the mugshot was released, it sent a shockwave through Oklahoma City. The man who once represented law and safety now stood as a symbol of predation in uniform. The trial began in late 2015, lasting over a month. The courtroom became a collision of power and vulnerability. Each victim took the stand, recounting in excruciating detail what he had done to them. Some cried, others trembled in silence. Holtzclaw's defense argued that the victims were unreliable, that their criminal pasts made them easy to manipulate or misremember events. But the evidence was unshakable. GPS data, forensic traces, and most importantly, the haunting consistency of each testimony. When the verdict was read on December 10, 2015, Holtzclaw collapsed in tears. Guilty on 18 counts of rape, sexual battery, and forcible oral sodomy. The judge sentenced him to 263 years in prison, effectively a life sentence several times over. The courtroom erupted in emotion. Some victims wept in relief. Others stared blankly, too drained to feel vindicated. Justice had been served, but the damage was permanent. In the aftermath, the Oklahoma City Police Department faced heavy scrutiny. How could a predator operate under their watch for so long? Why had complaints been ignored until a victim with social credibility came forward? The answers were buried beneath systemic bias, a truth the city was reluctant to confront. But for the women of East Oklahoma City, the verdict meant something rare, that their voices had finally mattered. Years later, documentaries and investigative series would revisit Holtzclaw's case, each asking the same chilling question: how many others like him wore the same badge, protected by silence and doubt? His story became a symbol not just of personal corruption, but of institutional blindness, the danger that arises when authority is allowed to hide its crimes behind respectability. In prison, Holtzclaw continues to proclaim his innocence, but for his victims, justice, though painful, remains their truth. It's a story of power turned poisonous, of trust betrayed by the very figure sworn to protect. And it stands as a grim reminder. The uniform doesn't always mean safety. In Bolingbrook, Illinois, Officer Drew Peterson was known as the kind of cop who got results. A confident, often charming presence on the force, he was respected by colleagues and trusted by his community. But behind the closed doors of suburban normalcy, Peterson's life was a tangle of manipulation, control, and violence, one that would eventually unravel into one of the most infamous cases in modern American law enforcement. Peterson joined the police department in the 1970s and climbed the ranks steadily. He was personable, witty, and skilled at reading people, traits that made him both effective as an officer and dangerous as a man. His relationships, however, told a different story. 4 marriages, each ending in turmoil. Accusations of abuse surfaced repeatedly, but Peterson always managed to explain them away. She was unstable, he'd say. She's overreacting. His badge, his charm, and his authority gave him protection that most men could only dream of. Then came Kathleen Savio, his 3rd wife. She was spirited, independent, and unafraid to challenge him. Their marriage started passionately, but the cracks appeared fast. Friends recalled shouting matches, bruises hidden under long sleeves, and a fear in Kathleen's eyes that she tried to disguise as exhaustion. By 2003, their marriage had disintegrated into chaos. Police were called to their home multiple times for domestic disturbances, but every report seemed to vanish into thin air. Peterson's colleagues handled the calls. He knew how the system worked and how to make it work for him. In 2004, just weeks before their divorce was finalized, Kathleen was found dead in her bathtub. The scene was bizarre. Her hair wet, her body face down, a small gash on her head. The coroner called it an accident. No signs of forced entry, no defensive wounds. Peterson's alibi was airtight. He was on duty. Case closed. For years, no one questioned it further. Then came Stacy. She was 19 when she met Drew Peterson. He was 47. A power imbalance from the start, masked as romance. Friends said she seemed happy at first, but as time went on, she became increasingly withdrawn. By 2007, the marriage looked perfect on the surface. A young wife, 2 small children, and a neat suburban home. But beneath the surface, fear simmered. In October 2007, Stacy Peterson disappeared, vanished without a trace. Drew's explanation was simple. She'd run off with another man. But those who knew her didn't believe it. She adored her children and was deeply involved in their care. She wouldn't just vanish. The case exploded in the media. The missing young wife of a veteran police officer, a man who had already lost one wife under mysterious circumstances. Reporters swarmed Bolingbrook. Peterson relished the attention, even joking on national TV. "I'm not worried," he said on the Today Show, smirking as he denied any involvement. "I didn't do anything wrong." But behind the spectacle, investigators began reopening Kathleen Savio's death. With Stacy missing, her family pushed authorities to look back. This time, new forensic experts examined the autopsy photos and immediately saw red flags. The bruises on Kathleen's body, the position of her limbs, the dried blood on the tub. It didn't match an accidental drowning. In 2008, her death was reclassified as a homicide. The body was exhumed, and the autopsy confirmed what many had long suspected. Kathleen Savio had been murdered. The dominoes began to fall. In 2009, Drew Peterson was arrested for Kathleen's murder. The case was largely circumstantial, built on witness statements, prior abuse, and a chilling piece of testimony known as hearsay evidence, statements from Stacy before her disappearance. She had told friends and a pastor that if she ever went missing, Drew had done it. Those words, spoken in fear, would help convict him. The trial in 2012 was tense, theatrical, and emotionally charged. Prosecutors painted Peterson as a manipulative sociopath, a man who used his badge as both shield and weapon. They presented years of abuse, control, and threats. The defense fought back, arguing the state had no physical evidence tying him to the crime. But the pattern was undeniable. 2 wives, 2 suspicious outcomes, 1 man at the center. When the jury delivered its verdict, guilty of first-degree murder, the courtroom erupted. Peterson showed no emotion. The judge sentenced him to 38 years in prison. He smirked as he was led away, still maintaining his innocence. Years later, Peterson's arrogance caught up with him again. In 2016, while serving time, He was caught plotting to have the prosecutor who convicted him killed. That earned him an additional 40 years. It was as if he couldn't stop trying to control the narrative, even from behind bars. Stacy Peterson's body has never been found. Her family continues to search, clinging to hope that one day she'll be brought home. Drew Peterson remains incarcerated, his once polished image long shattered. The former officer who once swore to uphold the law now spends his days confined by it. A living cautionary tale of how unchecked power and ego can rot a man from the inside out. In the end, the image of Drew Peterson, the smiling cop on television, joking about his missing wife, became one of the most haunting symbols of betrayal in law enforcement history. It was the smirk of a man who thought he was untouchable, caught at last in the justice he once claimed to serve. In the 1980s, New York City was drowning in crime. The crack epidemic had ripped through neighborhoods, and the NYPD was stretched thin. In those years, few streets were more dangerous than those patrolled by the 75th Precinct in Brooklyn, a district so violent it was nicknamed the Killing Fields. Among the officers assigned, there was a young cop named Michael Dowd. He was ambitious, confident, and street smart. But as the city's underworld thrived, Dowd found a way to make it work for him, turning the badge into a business. Dowd joined the NYPD in 1982, just 21 years old. He was brash, outspoken, and already disillusioned by what he saw as an impossible job. The pay was low, the risk was high, and the moral lines blurred more easily than anyone wanted to admit. "You either starved or you found a way to survive," he'd later say. His way of surviving involved cash. Lots of it, from the very criminals he was supposed to arrest. It started small, pocketing a few dollars here, looking the other way there. Drug dealers needed protection, and Dowd provided it. Soon, he was not just ignoring crimes, he was actively helping to run them. He'd warn dealers about upcoming raids, transport cocaine in his patrol car, and collect taxes from dealers in exchange for his silence. It was a system that worked, as long as everyone played their part. And for nearly a decade they did. Dowd's partner, Officer Kenny Urel, was drawn in slowly. At first reluctant, then addicted to the easy money. Together, they built a network of corruption so deep it blurred the line between police and criminal. Dowd carried 2 radios, one for the precinct and one for the dealers. They'd spend nights drinking, snorting coke, and driving through the city in a squad car packed with stolen drugs. "I wasn't a cop," Dowd later admitted. "I was a drug dealer with a badge." By the late 80s, Dowd was making thousands a week. He bought a house on Long Island, drove flashy cars, and lived openly beyond his means. The department noticed, but no one said anything. In an era of record crime rates, few wanted to question an officer who seemed to get results. The silence of the system became his greatest protection. Then, in 1992, everything began to unravel. A drug dealer named Adam Diaz, one of Dowd's biggest connections, was arrested. Facing serious time, Diaz started talking. He told investigators about the crooked cop who worked for him, a white officer from the 75th Precinct who delivered information, moved cocaine, and collected envelopes of cash. The description fit Michael Dowd perfectly. The case landed on the desk of the Suffolk County Police Department, and soon Internal Affairs and the DEA got involved. They placed Dowd under surveillance, tapping phones, following his movements, and recording his meetings. What they uncovered was staggering. Not just one bad cop, but a culture of corruption that infected an entire precinct. In May 1992, Dowd and Urel were arrested in a sting operation. They had been caught delivering cocaine for a dealer in Long Island. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves through New York. An NYPD officer trafficking drugs was one thing, but the extent of his network made it far worse. The department scrambled to contain the fallout, but the truth couldn't be buried. Dowd's arrest led to the creation of the Mullen Commission, a public inquiry into corruption within the NYPD. Over months of testimony, the commission exposed decades of misconduct, officers planting evidence, stealing from dealers, even committing robberies. But it was Dowd's testimony that electrified the nation. On live television, he sat before the panel and calmly confessed to years of crime. He spoke with brutal honesty, not to seek redemption, but to expose the rot that had been ignored. "I took money," he said. "I took drugs. I was a cop, and I was a criminal." The room was silent. For the public, it was a revelation. For the department, a humiliation. Dowd's words forced a reckoning within the NYPD, one that would take years to repair. In 1994, Michael Dowd was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. His partner, Kenny Urell, cooperated with prosecutors and served a reduced sentence. Dowd's life behind bars became another kind of lesson: the cost of unchecked power and moral decay. He was released in 2004 after serving 12 years. Today, he speaks openly about his past, appearing in documentaries like The 7-5, recounting the decisions that turned him from protector to predator. But no matter how many interviews he gives or how reflective he sounds, the truth remains. He was the embodiment of what happens when the system stops watching its own. The people of East New York still remember those years, when sirens didn't mean safety, and when cops like Michael Dowd blurred the line between the law and the streets. His story isn't just about one man's corruption. It's about how power, when left unchecked, can twist anyone into believing they're untouchable. Dowd once said he felt like a king in those days. The dealers feared him, his bosses ignored him, and the city itself looked the other way. But kings fall, and when he did, it wasn't the streets that betrayed him. It was the silence of a system that finally ran out of excuses. In New Orleans, the mid-1990s were marked by crime, corruption, and a police department struggling to regain public trust. But even in a city used to headlines about misconduct, the story of Officer Antoinette Frank was almost impossible to comprehend. A police officer who didn't just betray her badge, but used it to carry out cold-blooded murder. Antoinette Frank joined the New Orleans Police Department in 1993. She was 22, shy, and soft-spoken, the kind of recruit her superiors thought could bring a gentler image to a force often criticized for brutality. But her quiet demeanor masked something else entirely: instability, desperation, and an obsession with control. Her fellow officers noticed odd behavior from the start. She was overly emotional, erratic under pressure, and seemed to crave attention from her superiors. Still, with the department chronically short on officers, red flags were easy to ignore. By 1994, Frank had earned the trust of the community she patrolled, particularly a small Vietnamese family who owned a popular restaurant called Kim An. The Vu family welcomed her like one of their own. She ate meals there for free, spent time with the family, and even brought friends along. One of those friends would turn out to be her accomplice, a 19-year-old drug dealer named Rogers Lacaze. Frank met Lacaze while on patrol. He was handsome, manipulative, and dangerous. Together, they formed a toxic relationship built on greed and thrill-seeking. Within months, they were committing crimes together, using her police status to facilitate carjackings, robberies, and drug deals. It was a secret double life, and for a while no one suspected a thing. But Frank's financial problems were spiraling. She'd taken loans she couldn't pay, and her gambling debts were mounting. She began stealing money from the Kim An restaurant, using her position of trust to slip cash from the register. When the Vu family confronted her about it, she feigned innocence. But inside, resentment was building. She told Lacaze they had to get rid of them, believing that robbing the restaurant could solve their problems once and for all. On the night of March 4, 1995, the plan went into motion. It was after midnight when Frank and Lacaze entered Kim An, both armed, both wearing black. Frank's police badge allowed them inside easily. Inside were Ha Vu, her brother Quang, their parents, and two young workers, Ronald and Quang Vu, no relation. Also present was Officer Ronald Williams, an off-duty cop working as a security guard for the restaurant, and one of the few people who trusted Frank completely. They ordered everyone to the ground. It was quick, chaotic, and silent except for the sound of guns being cocked. Ronald Williams was shot first, point-blank execution style. Then, in cold precision, Frank turned her weapon on the Vu siblings. Ha and Quang were killed instantly. Only one person survived, 13-year-old Xiao Vu, who had hidden under a table, trembling as she watched her family murdered by a woman she'd once called Antoinette. When the shooting stopped, Frank and Lacaze fled, taking a small amount of cash, less than $2,000, and leaving behind a scene of carnage. Xiao, shaking and bleeding from a grazing wound, crawled to the phone and called 911. When police arrived, she told them who did it. Antoinette Frank. She killed them. The responding officers were stunned. They knew Frank. Some refused to believe it. But as the night unfolded, evidence made it undeniable. Frank returned to the scene later, feigning shock, pretending to be just another officer responding to the call. Her colleagues noticed her trembling, her inconsistent story. She claimed she'd been home, that her car had trouble starting. But witnesses had already seen her at the restaurant earlier that night, twice. The second time, minutes before the murders. Within hours, Frank and Lacaze were arrested. The news tore through the department and the city like wildfire. A New Orleans police officer murdering civilians and a fellow cop, it was almost unthinkable. As detectives pieced together the timeline, the betrayal deepened. Frank had used her badge, her uniform, and her sworn authority to walk victims calmly to their deaths. During the trial, prosecutors painted her as cold and calculating, driven by greed and resentment. The defense tried to argue she was manipulated by Lacaze, a woman under his control, emotionally unstable. But the evidence was too strong. Ballistic tests linked her weapon to the murders. Her fingerprints were everywhere. The surviving child's testimony sealed her fate. In 1995, Antoinette Frank was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. She became one of the few women on death row in Louisiana. Lacaze received the same sentence. The families of the victims wept as the verdict was read, their pain a haunting echo of the lives stolen that night. The aftermath was devastating for the New Orleans Police Department. Frank's crimes deepened an already growing distrust between the police and the public, particularly among the city's immigrant communities. The department faced a reckoning, not just for her actions, but for the failures that let her wear a badge in the first place. Background checks had shown signs of instability. She'd even been rejected from the academy once for psychological issues, only to be accepted later when staffing needs grew desperate. Years later, Frank remains on death row at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women. She rarely speaks to the media. Her once gentle face now serves as a symbol of betrayal, not just of the law, but of the human trust it's supposed to represent. The small restaurant, Kim An, has long since closed, but for the Vu family and the people of New Orleans, the memory lingers, a night when a police uniform became the disguise of a murderer, and when justice itself had to hunt one of its own. Florida in the early 1970s was a place of contradictions, sun-drenched beaches, quiet suburban growth, and beneath it all, a rising darkness. It was an era that birthed some of America's most notorious killers. But what made Gerard John Schaefer different was that he was one of the men the public was supposed to trust. A sworn law enforcement officer, a man with a badge and authority. And while he patrolled the streets by day, by night, he stalked, hunted, and murdered. Schaefer joined the police force in Martin County, Florida in 1971. He was intelligent, articulate, and had an almost academic fascination with control. To his superiors, he appeared competent, perhaps even overzealous. To his victims, he was the embodiment of nightmare. His crimes were not spontaneous acts of rage, but carefully constructed fantasies acted out under the guise of authority. His first known victims were 2 teenage girls, Nancy Trotter and Paula Wells. On April 20th, 1972, Schaefer spotted them hitchhiking near Jensen Beach. He stopped, flashing his badge, and offered them a safer ride. They trusted him instantly. After all, he was a cop. But instead of taking them to safety, he drove them into a remote wooded area. There, at gunpoint, he tied them to trees, gagged them, and told them he intended to teach them a lesson about the dangers of hitchhiking. Then fate intervened. Schaefer was called away on a police matter and, in a bizarre twist, released the girls, promising it would never happen again. The 2 terrified teens went straight to the station and reported him. His superiors were shocked. A complaint of abduction against one of their own. Schaefer denied everything, claiming it was a scared-straight tactic gone wrong. The department suspended him, but within weeks he was quietly fired, not arrested. They wanted the matter to disappear. 3 months later, 2 more girls, Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, vanished near the same area. Their skeletal remains were found a year later, tied to trees in the same manner described by Schaefer's earlier victims. The similarity was undeniable. The man who had once been accused of abduction now looked like a serial killer. Investigators began connecting dots. Reports of missing women in surrounding counties had eerie consistencies. Hitchhikers, runaways, girls last seen near roads Schaefer patrolled. A search of his home revealed something horrifying. Boxes of jewelry, diaries, purses, and personal effects belonging to women who had disappeared. Even worse, a collection of handwritten stories, graphic, sadistic tales of torture and murder that read like confessions disguised as fiction. In one story, he wrote of a man who abducted two women, tied them to trees, and described their fear in vivid detail. Another told of a killer who returned to his victims' corpses to mutilate them. When detectives read these writings, it was as if they had entered the mind of a man who saw murder not as crime, but as creation. "Reality," Schaefer wrote in one of his journals, "is what I make it." When confronted with the evidence, Schaefer alternated between arrogance and denial. He claimed he was a writer, that his stories were fiction, and that the items found in his home were keepsakes given to him by women he'd dated. But the forensic evidence told a different story, and the remains of Place and Jessup sealed his fate. In 1973, Gerard Schaefer was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. But authorities suspected he'd killed many more, possibly dozens. His writings hinted at victims buried, drowned, or discarded in remote Florida marshes. Over time, investigators linked him to as many as 30 missing women, though definitive proof was elusive. Schaefer seemed to enjoy the ambiguity, feeding on the attention. He'd write letters from prison mocking journalists, boasting of more than 80 perfect murders, and taunting detectives with clues that led nowhere. He became one of America's first known serial killer cops, his dual life horrifying both the public and the law enforcement community. His case forced departments across the country to re-examine their hiring standards. How had a man with a history of violence, misogyny, and psychological instability ever been given a badge? The answer, as usual, was bureaucracy and neglect. In prison, Schaefer continued to write short stories, essays, letters to true crime authors. His tone was chillingly detached, as if he viewed his crimes as intellectual exercises rather than atrocities. Other inmates despised him. He bragged constantly, reciting details of murders and belittling victims. One prisoner later said he liked to sound like he was smarter than everyone, even God. On December 3, 1995, justice came from an unexpected source. Schaefer was found stabbed to death in his cell, his throat slashed, his body mutilated. His killer was another inmate, Vincent Rivera, serving time for double murder. Rivera later said he couldn't stand Schaefer's arrogance anymore. He wouldn't shut up about killing women, Rivera told guards afterward. "So I shut him up. When news of his death spread, few mourned. For the families of the missing, it was closure. Imperfect, but something." Investigators continued to match his writings to cold cases, and though many questions remained unanswered, one truth was clear. Gerard Schaefer had used his badge not to protect, but to hunt. He was the wolf in uniform, proof that evil could wear authority like a mask. Even decades later, his story endures as a grim warning. The man who once pulled drivers over with a smile and a flash of blue lights had been a predator all along. And the roads of Florida, those long, sunlit highways, still hold the shadows of the girls who never made it home. Chicago in the 1990s was a city split between two worlds, the glittering skyline of business and politics, and the underbelly of gangs, drugs, and corruption. The Chicago Police Department had always struggled with internal scandals, but few cases captured the rot at its core like that of Sergeant Joe Miedzionowski, a veteran narcotics officer, who built his career on fighting drug dealers while secretly running his own drug empire behind the badge. Miedzionowski joined the Chicago PD in 1970. He was street-savvy, tough, and knew how to navigate the city's most dangerous neighborhoods. To his colleagues, he was the kind of cop who could get things done, unafraid to bend rules if it meant catching bad guys. But as the years went on, those bent rules became broken laws, and his war on drugs turned into a business built on betrayal. By the late 1980s, Miedzionowski had been assigned to the elite gang crimes unit, a position that gave him access to informants, surveillance intel, and seized narcotics. It also placed him in daily contact with the very people he was supposed to take down. He began cultivating relationships with gang members, particularly those connected to the Gangster Disciples, Chicago's most powerful criminal organization. At first, he used them for information. Then he started using them for profit. He realized that with his badge, he could move drugs through the city with near impunity. He'd warn dealers about upcoming raids, sell confiscated drugs back onto the streets, and use police resources to eliminate competition. When one of his gang contacts needed a rival taken down, Miedzionowski would orchestrate a bust, arresting or intimidating anyone who stood in their way. To the outside world, he was a cop cleaning up the streets. In reality, he was running them. He built a network of officers who helped cover for him, some knowingly, others unwittingly. Cash moved quietly through hands. Arrest reports were falsified. Evidence vanished. Meanwhile, Miedzionowski lived lavishly. New cars, expensive suits, and side businesses that made little sense for a police salary. Still, no one dared question him. His reputation as a results-driven officer protected him from scrutiny. But in 1997, a tip reached the FBI's Chicago field office. A confidential informant claimed that one of the city's own narcotics officers was selling cocaine, and not small quantities. The name he gave them was one they knew well: Joe Miedzionowski. The FBI opened an investigation, partnering with Internal Affairs and the U.S. Attorney's Office. What they found would unravel one of the largest police corruption cases in American history. Over months of surveillance, wiretaps, and undercover operations, agents gathered overwhelming evidence. They recorded phone calls between Miedzionowski and gang leaders discussing shipments, payments, and protection deals. They tracked the flow of drugs and money, from the cartel suppliers to Miedzionowski's own associates inside the police force. The very unit meant to dismantle drug operations had become one. The turning point came in 1998, when one of his associates was arrested and offered a deal. The informant handed over detailed ledgers, handwritten notes documenting years of transactions, names, and drop locations. It was all there in black and white, proof that Sergeant Joe Miedzionowski had been running a double life for nearly a decade. In April 1998, federal agents finally moved in. Miedzionowski was arrested at his home and charged with racketeering, drug trafficking, and extortion. The image of a seasoned Chicago sergeant being led away in handcuffs made national headlines. For a department already struggling with public trust, it was a devastating blow. His trial in 2001 was explosive. Prosecutors painted a portrait of a man who had turned law enforcement into organized crime, a police officer who not only protected dealers but supplied them. Witness after witness testified to his involvement: gang members, former informants, even other officers. They told stories of meetings in squad cars, cash payments slipped in envelopes, and Miedzionowski himself laughing about how being a cop makes you bulletproof. The defense argued that the witnesses were criminals trying to save themselves. But the wiretaps, financial records, and drug ledgers told the real story. When the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts, the courtroom fell silent. Miedzionowski showed little emotion. He'd spent his career manipulating systems of power. Now those same systems had turned on him. He was sentenced to life in federal prison. In their closing statements, prosecutors called him the most corrupt cop in the history of Chicago. It wasn't hyperbole. His case exposed deep cracks within the department: the culture of silence, the unchecked authority, and the thin line between enforcer and criminal. Over a dozen others were charged as a result of the investigation, including officers, dealers, and middlemen who had operated under his watch. In the years since, Miedzionowski has become a cautionary tale in police academies across the country. His story is studied not for its brilliance, but for its audacity: how a single officer built a criminal network inside the institution meant to stop it. He once told a fellow inmate, "Cops and dealers, they're not that different. Both play the game. One just wears the uniform." For the city of Chicago, the scars remain. Every time another corruption scandal surfaces, his name resurfaces too. A reminder that the most dangerous criminals aren't always the ones hiding in the shadows. Sometimes they're the ones shining a flashlight on everyone else. In the late 1980s, New York City was drowning in cocaine. The crack epidemic had turned neighborhoods like East New York and Brownsville into war zones, and the NYPD was stretched thin, overwhelmed, underpaid, and constantly on the defensive. Among the officers patrolling those streets was Michael Dowd, a tall, cocky cop from Long Island with an easy smile and a dangerous appetite for money. Dowd joined the force in 1982, a 21-year-old rookie full of swagger. At first, he played the part, chasing suspects, making arrests, doing the kind of street-level police work that earned respect from his peers. But the chaos of the crack era was unlike anything he'd seen. Dealers had cash, guns, and power. The cops had long hours, low pay, and little recognition. It didn't take long for Dowd to start asking himself a dangerous question: why not get a piece of it? He began small. A few bribes here, a free meal there. Then one day a local dealer offered him $500 a week to watch his back. All Dowd had to do was stay out of his way, look the other way when product was being moved, make sure the competition got the heat instead. It was easy money and no one seemed to notice. Soon Dowd was earning more from drug dealers than from the NYPD. He wasn't alone. His partner, Kenny Urell, soon joined in, and together they became known as the Dirty Duo. They were the kind of cops who drove the best cars, partied hard, and lived far above their means. They supplied information about raids, sold confiscated drugs back to the streets, and even started delivering cocaine themselves. With badges and guns, they could operate in broad daylight without suspicion. Dowd's operation grew bolder with each passing year. He formed an alliance with a major Dominican drug lord named Adam Diaz, who ran one of Brooklyn's biggest cocaine networks. Dowd and Urell became his on-call protection service, guarding shipments, escorting cash drops, and intimidating rivals. Diaz paid them thousands weekly, and in return, Dowd made sure no one touched his territory. It was corruption on a cinematic scale, and for years no one in the department caught on. Dowd's arrest numbers were low, but his reports were clean. Internal Affairs was underfunded and reluctant to target its own. Dowd joked that he was untouchable, and for nearly a decade he was right. But cracks began to form. In 1992, Dowd's partner Urell started to panic. The money was good, but the paranoia was worse. Their lavish lifestyle, boats, vacations, and stacks of cash, had started to raise eyebrows. When Internal Affairs began probing suspicious activity in Brooklyn's 75th Precinct, Urell was quietly approached by federal agents. Fearing jail time, he agreed to wear a wire. For months, Urell secretly recorded Dowd's conversations. The tapes captured everything. Dowd bragging about bribes, discussing drug deliveries, even laughing about beating the system. "I'm a cop and a crook," he said on one recording, "and I'll die both." The evidence was undeniable. On May 6, 1992, Dowd was arrested in a sting operation that sent shockwaves through New York. The press called him the most corrupt cop in America. During his trial, the depth of his betrayal became clear: extortion, racketeering, drug trafficking, and theft. He wasn't just protecting criminals. He was one. He'd turned his patrol car into a courier vehicle for cocaine. But what stunned the public most wasn't just Dowd's crimes. It was how long they'd been ignored. Investigators uncovered years of complaints and warnings about the 75th Precinct. Officers who tried to speak up were silenced or transferred. The department's own oversight system had failed spectacularly, and Dowd had thrived in that vacuum. During testimony before the Mullen Commission, a panel investigating police corruption, Dowd sat in a dark suit and spoke bluntly about his crimes. There was no remorse, no excuses, just cold truth. "I was a cop who became a criminal," he said. "And I did it because I could." His candor horrified the public but exposed the rot within the NYPD. The hearings became front-page news, sparking reforms that reshaped how police oversight worked in New York. Dowd was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. His partner, Urell, received a reduced sentence for cooperating. Adam Diaz was already behind bars. The empire they'd built on cocaine and corruption collapsed overnight. Yet even in disgrace, Dowd remained defiant. In interviews years later, he described himself not as evil, but as a product of the system. He claimed the temptation was too great, the oversight too weak, the money too easy. After his release, Dowd became a dark celebrity of sorts, featured in the 2014 documentary, The 7-5, which laid bare the culture of corruption that had once ruled New York's most dangerous precinct. Watching him recount his crimes decades later, the chilling thing isn't his arrogance, it's his honesty. "You give a cop a gun, a badge, and no supervision," he said, "and he becomes what you let him become." Michael Dowd's story isn't just about one man's fall. It's about a department, a city, and a system that looked away too long. The damage he did wasn't measured in drugs or dollars, but in trust. Because every time he took a bribe, every time he protected a dealer, every time he laughed at justice, he made the badge mean less for everyone who still wore it with pride. It was September 6, 2018, in Dallas, Texas. An ordinary Thursday evening that would become one of the most controversial and emotionally charged nights in modern policing history. Amber Geiger, a 30-year-old Dallas police officer, had just finished a long shift and drove home to her apartment building in the South Side Flats. She was tired, distracted, and still in uniform. What happened next would end an innocent man's life and ignite a national conversation about justice, race, and accountability. Geiger parked her car on the fourth floor of the building's garage, the same spot she always used, or so she thought. But in her fatigue, she had parked on the wrong floor. The Southside flats had identical hallways and doors on each level, a detail that would soon become central to her defense. She exited the elevator, walked down what she believed was her hallway, and approached what she believed was her apartment. Inside, 26-year-old Botham Jean, an accountant originally from St. Lucia, was relaxing in his home. He was a beloved member of his church, known for his kindness and integrity. He'd just finished dinner and was watching television when he heard someone at his door. Before he could react, the door opened and Amber Geiger stepped inside. In that moment, she later claimed, she believed she had walked in on a burglar. The lights were dim. The layout looked similar to her own apartment, but things felt off. There was a man standing in the living room, and she said she panicked. Within seconds, she drew her gun and fired twice. One bullet struck Botham Jean in the chest. He fell to the floor, bleeding and confused. As he gasped for air, Geiger realized, too late, that she was in the wrong apartment. When paramedics arrived, Jean was pronounced dead at the hospital. The scene was surreal. The apartment number on the door was 1478. Geiger's was 1378, directly one floor below. His red doormat, bright and distinctive, should have told her she wasn't home. But in that brief, irreversible moment, exhaustion, assumption, and lethal force collided. The next morning, news of the shooting spread rapidly. A white police officer had killed an unarmed black man in his own home. Protests erupted across Dallas. To many, it was another tragic example of systemic bias. The idea that a black man's mere presence could be perceived as a threat, even in his own space. The Dallas Police Department placed Geiger on administrative leave while the Texas Rangers and Dallas County District Attorney began a criminal investigation. Geiger claimed it was a terrible mistake, a tragic accident that could happen to anyone under the right or wrong circumstances. But to the public, it was more than that. It was negligence compounded by power, an officer trained to assess danger who had failed at the most basic level. The outrage grew when initial reports suggested she wasn't immediately arrested. For 3 days, she remained free, further fueling accusations of preferential treatment. Eventually, Geiger was charged with manslaughter, later upgraded to murder. The trial began in September 2019, 1 year after the shooting. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, activists, family members, and ordinary citizens who wanted to see if justice would finally match the crime. The prosecution argued that Geiger's actions were unreasonable by every standard, that any normal person would have noticed the signs that she wasn't home. They pointed to the red doormat, the distinct smell of Jean's apartment, the unlocked door that she claimed was ajar. And above all, they emphasized the simple fact that Botham Jean posed no threat. Geiger's defense centered on a claim of mistaken belief. They argued she had genuinely thought she was in danger, that her mistake of location was honest if tragic. The jury was forced to weigh intent against consequence. Did she mean to kill, or did she simply make an unfathomable mistake? Witness testimony painted a haunting picture. Neighbors described hearing 2 shots, then Geiger crying out, "Oh my God, I'm sorry." Others said she didn't immediately attempt CPR, and that her first call was to her partner on the force, not 911. The prosecution used that detail to highlight a chilling detachment, a failure to prioritize the dying man in front of her. The verdict came on October 1, 2019. After deliberating, the jury found Amber Geiger guilty of murder. Gasps filled the courtroom. It was a rare outcome. A police officer convicted of murder in an on-duty shooting, even if technically off-duty. The next day, she was sentenced to 10 years in prison. But what happened after the sentencing stunned the world. Botham Jean's younger brother, Brant Jean, took the stand. Instead of anger, he offered forgiveness. He asked to hug Geiger, and with the judge's permission, he did. A long, emotional embrace that left the courtroom in tears. It was a moment that transcended rage, even as it divided opinions. Some called it a display of grace. Others saw it as a symbol of a system that too often expects forgiveness from victims of injustice. Geiger's case became a touchstone for debates about police accountability and the limits of empathy. She appealed her conviction, arguing that she acted under mistaken belief, but the courts upheld the verdict. She remains in prison, eligible for parole after serving 5 years. For Dallas, the name Botham Jean still echoes. His apartment number, 1478, has become a quiet symbol, a reminder that one person's error, when armed with authority, can destroy entire families. For Amber Geiger, the years behind bars are a shadow of what her uniform once meant. And for the public, her story serves as a haunting question about perception, bias, and the price of a single second's mistake. Bolingbrook, Illinois, was the kind of quiet suburb where nothing much happened, at least not until one of its police sergeants turned his home into the center of one of the most infamous true crime cases in American history. Drew Peterson had been a cop for nearly 3 decades, a charismatic, smooth-talking officer who smiled for cameras and made neighbors feel safe. But behind the charm, he was a man who manipulated, controlled, and, as it would later turn out, murdered. Peterson's story begins long before his name became a tabloid headline. He joined the Bolingbrook Police Department in the late 1970s and quickly rose through the ranks. He was confident, even likable, but colleagues noticed something darker beneath the surface. Arrogance, volatility, and a hunger for control. That control extended to his relationships. Over the years, he married 4 times, and each marriage ended worse than the last. His third wife, Kathleen Savio, had once been deeply in love with him. They'd shared a nice home, financial comfort, and 2 children. But as Peterson's personality hardened, so did the marriage. Kathleen confided to friends that she was afraid of him, that he watched her constantly, that he'd threatened to kill her and make it look like an accident. In 2003, their marriage ended in a bitter divorce, and Peterson quickly moved on to a new relationship with a 19-year-old woman named Stacy Kales. By 2004, he and Stacy were married despite the nearly 30-year age gap. Meanwhile, Kathleen continued to tell anyone who would listen that her ex-husband might hurt her one day. In March of that year, she was found dead in her bathtub. The police, Peterson's own colleagues, ruled it an accident. They said she'd slipped, hit her head, and drowned. There were bruises on her body, but no one questioned them too deeply. Peterson attended her funeral in uniform, offering condolences, his badge glinting under the sun. For the next 3 years, life seemed to move on. Peterson retired from the force, drew his pension, and enjoyed his new family. But then, in October 2007, everything changed. Stacy Peterson, his 4th wife, vanished. Peterson claimed she'd left him, that she'd run off with another man and abandoned their 2 young children. But those who knew Stacy knew better. She'd been confiding in her pastor and friends that she wanted to leave Drew, that she was terrified of him, that he'd been watching her every move. She even told people she feared she'd end up like Kathleen. Then one Sunday morning, she simply disappeared. Her car was found at a nearby airport, but there was no sign she'd boarded a plane. Detectives searched their home, surrounding areas, lakes and fields, but Stacy was gone. Her family begged for answers. Peterson played the role of the grieving husband on national television, even giving interviews on shows like Today and Larry King Live, where he smirked and joked with hosts, insisting he was innocent. But the more he talked, the guiltier he looked. Public outrage grew, and soon investigators reopened Kathleen Savio's death. They exhumed her body, and this time forensic examiners found clear signs of foul play. Her injuries were consistent with a struggle, not an accident. The new autopsy concluded she had been murdered. Drew Peterson, once the cop who upheld the law, was now its prime suspect. In May 2009, Peterson was arrested and charged with Kathleen's murder. Prosecutors faced a major hurdle. Stacy's disappearance meant their key witness, and the one person who could directly implicate him, was gone. But Illinois had something called the forfeiture by wrongdoing rule, allowing testimony from deceased witnesses if their absence was caused by the defendant. Stacy's friends and pastor were allowed to testify about what she'd told them before she vanished. Statements about Drew's threats, his temper, and his confessions about Kathleen's death. The trial became a media circus. Peterson's grin once his charm became his mask. He laughed in court, cracked jokes with reporters, and mocked prosecutors. But behind that arrogance was a man watching his empire crumble. His defense argued there was no physical evidence linking him to Kathleen's death, but the mountain of circumstantial proof, along with his pattern of manipulation, told a darker story. In September 2012, after 14 hours of deliberation, the jury found Drew Peterson guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 38 years in prison. As the verdict was read, his smile finally broke. The once proud officer who strutted through the halls of the Bolingbrook Police Department now sat shackled, staring at the floor. But the story didn't end there. Even from prison, Peterson couldn't stop trying to control the narrative. In 2016, he was convicted again, this time for attempting to hire a hitman to kill the prosecutor who put him behind bars. That earned him another 40 years. Today, he remains imprisoned, still denying involvement in either woman's death. Stacy Peterson's body has never been found. The legacy of Drew Peterson is one of betrayal, a police officer who weaponized his authority to manipulate, abuse, and ultimately destroy. His badge was a shield not for the public but for himself. He knew how investigations worked, how evidence could disappear, how to make threats sound like promises. He wasn't just a man who committed murder. He was a man who understood exactly how to get away with it. The tragedy of his story isn't only in the deaths of Kathleen and Stacy, it's in how long he was able to hide behind the very institution meant to stop men like him. A uniform gave him credibility, a gun gave him confidence, and the law gave him cover. In the end, what brought him down wasn't justice catching up. It was arrogance finally collapsing under its own weight. In 2014, Oklahoma City trusted one of its own, a young, clean-cut officer named Daniel Holtzclaw. He looked like the model of discipline and strength, a former college football player, a promising police recruit, and the kind of man the department liked to showcase in uniform. But beneath that polished exterior was something monstrous. Over the course of 6 terrifying months, Holtzclaw used his badge not to protect his community, but to prey upon it. Holtzclaw joined the Oklahoma City Police Department in 2011. He was tall, athletic, and ambitious, eager to climb the ranks. His beat covered a low-income area of northeast Oklahoma City, a predominantly black neighborhood with a long history of distrust toward law enforcement. Many residents saw him as just another cop patrolling poor streets for easy arrests. But Holtzclaw wasn't after drugs or weapons. He was after women. Between December 2013 and June 2014, a series of women began sharing quiet, fearful stories, first to friends, then reluctantly to investigators. Each account sounded horrifyingly similar. A police officer had pulled them over, taken them aside, and assaulted them. Some said he threatened arrest if they didn't comply. Others said he used the pretext of searching for drugs or warrants to isolate them. All of them described the same man, a tall, muscular officer with piercing blue eyes, often in his patrol car late at night. At first, no one believed them. The victims were mostly poor black women, many with prior arrests for drugs or prostitution. Their voices didn't carry far in a system that often ignored them. Holtzclaw knew that, and he exploited it. He targeted women he believed wouldn't be taken seriously. His uniform gave him credibility. Their past gave him cover. It was a calculated pattern of predation. But on June 18, 2014, one woman, 57-year-old grandmother Janie Ligons, refused to stay silent. She had no criminal record, no connection to the others, and nothing to lose by speaking up. That night, Holtzclaw pulled her over after dark, claiming she'd been swerving. Instead of writing a ticket, he forced her into a humiliating sexual act. Ligons went straight to the police the next morning. This time they listened. Her detailed description matched the reports of several other women that Internal Affairs had quietly received. Investigators began tailing Holtzclaw's patrol routes, comparing his GPS logs and police reports against the times and locations of the alleged assaults. The data told a chilling story. His car had been exactly where the victims said at the exact times they described. They found a pattern: late-night stops in isolated areas, body cameras mysteriously turned off, no formal records of arrests or tickets. On June 23, 2014, Daniel Holtzclaw was brought in for questioning. Detectives asked him to walk them through his patrols, his contacts, his supposed traffic stops. At first, he denied everything, confident that his badge would protect him. But as they confronted him with mounting evidence, his composure began to crack. When they finally told him he was being placed on administrative leave, he broke down in tears, a rare moment of emotion that betrayed his fear more than his guilt. The investigation expanded quickly. By the time prosecutors filed charges, 13 women had come forward, ranging in age from 17 to 57. The stories were consistent, detailed, and harrowing. Holtzclaw faced 36 counts, including rape, sexual battery, and forcible oral sodomy. The sheer scale of his crimes stunned even seasoned investigators. This wasn't an impulsive act. It was a methodical campaign of abuse carried out under the guise of authority. His trial began in late 2015. For weeks, the courtroom listened as woman after woman took the stand. Their voices shook, but their stories didn't waver. They spoke of fear, of humiliation, of thinking no one would ever believe them, until one brave woman finally did. Prosecutors showed the jury how Holtzclaw's police car logs aligned perfectly with each attack. They presented his text messages, his GPS routes, and his reports, a paper trail of predation. Holtzclaw's defense team tried to portray him as the victim of false accusations, suggesting the women were lying to gain attention or compensation. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the defense's attempt to discredit the victims only strengthened the jury's outrage. In a devastating closing argument, the prosecutor said, "These women didn't choose him. He chose them because he thought they didn't matter." On December 10, 2015, Holtzclaw's 29th birthday, the jury returned its verdict, guilty, on 18 of the 36 counts, including rape. He was sentenced to 263 years in prison, effectively ensuring he would never walk free again. When the verdict was read, he sobbed uncontrollably, his uniform long replaced by prison blues. The women he had terrorized sat quietly, their courage finally recognized. The case sent shockwaves through Oklahoma and beyond. It forced departments nationwide to re-examine how officers are monitored, especially those working alone at night in vulnerable communities. It also sparked difficult conversations about race, power, and the invisibility of certain victims. These women had been ignored by society for most of their lives, until one officer's evil finally forced the world to listen. Daniel Holtzclaw remains behind bars, serving what amounts to a life sentence. His name has become synonymous with predatory policing, the ultimate betrayal of trust. He used his badge to hunt rather than protect, believing his victims' voices would never carry. But they did, and in doing so, they reclaimed not just their dignity, but a small measure of justice for every person who's ever been silenced by power. Holtzclaw's story is a chilling reminder that corruption in law enforcement doesn't always come in the form of bribes or stolen drugs. Sometimes it comes in the form of control, the belief that a uniform makes you untouchable. For his victims and for the city of Oklahoma, his conviction wasn't the end of the pain. It was the beginning of a reckoning that said, finally, that even a cop can't hide from the truth forever. Michigan's Upper Peninsula is a quiet place, endless forests, frozen lakes, and small towns where everyone knows everyone. It's not the kind of place where people expect evil to hide in plain sight. But for years, a man named Stephen Sanderson wore a badge there. He was a sheriff's deputy who was supposed to protect his community. Instead, he became one of the most disturbing examples of what happens when authority and violence blur beyond recognition. Sanderson joined law enforcement in the early 1990s. By all appearances, he was the ideal small-town deputy, calm, dependable, and respected by his peers. He handled domestic disputes, traffic stops, and the occasional bar fight with a steady hand. But off-duty, those who knew him described a very different man, withdrawn, brooding, and with flashes of cruelty that made people uneasy. Still, no one imagined he was capable of what he would one day confess to. In 1991, Sanderson responded to a domestic disturbance call involving a man named Robert Bobby Osborne, a local who had a reputation for trouble. The call ended with Osborne arrested and charged, but afterward, something strange happened. The two men became friends. They were seen drinking together, even fishing on weekends. To outsiders, it looked like a story of reconciliation, a cop giving a second chance to a man he'd once arrested. In truth, it was the start of something far darker. One evening, not long after a night of heavy drinking, Bobby Osborne disappeared. Friends said he'd gone to meet Sanderson but never came home. For weeks there were rumors that he'd skipped town, that he'd gotten into a fight, that maybe the cops knew more than they were saying. Sanderson told anyone who asked that he hadn't seen Bobby that night. There was no evidence, no body, no case. Life went on. Years later, in 1994, Sanderson left the sheriff's department under quiet circumstances. No scandal, no big headlines, just a resignation that no one questioned too deeply. He moved south, took odd jobs, and faded from memory. Then, in 2014, more than 2 decades after Osborne vanished, the story resurfaced in the most unexpected place, a Michigan prison. Sanderson was serving time for an unrelated murder, the killing of his cellmate, who he claimed had bragged about molesting a child. The media dubbed him the Snake because of his cold, remorseless demeanor. During an interview with investigators, he began to talk, not just about that murder, but about others. What he revealed stunned them. He admitted that in 1991 he had indeed killed Bobby Osborne. He said the two had been drinking heavily at his home when Osborne made a comment that enraged him. Sanderson claimed he snapped, grabbed a firearm, and shot Osborne in the head. Then, in a panic, he buried the body on his property, under a patch of loose soil near the woods. For over 20 years he'd lived with the secret, serving as a lawman while a corpse rotted just yards from his house. Detectives were skeptical at first. Inmates often confessed to crimes for attention. But when they searched the property, they found human remains exactly where he said. DNA confirmed it was Bobby Osborne. The quiet, trusted deputy had been a killer all along. The revelation sent shockwaves through the small Michigan community that had once trusted him. People who'd known Sanderson struggled to reconcile the man they'd waved to at the grocery store with the one who'd executed his friend in cold blood. The fact that he'd continued to wear a badge afterward made it worse. Every traffic stop, every arrest, every handshake from that point on felt like a betrayal. Prosecutors charged Sanderson with second-degree murder in Osborne's death. During his court appearances, he showed no emotion. He said he had to do what he had to do, offering no remorse and no explanation beyond vague references to anger and pride. When the judge asked him if he understood the gravity of what he'd done, Sanderson shrugged. "It's over now," he said simply. He was sentenced to an additional 40 years, on top of his existing life sentence. The courtroom fell silent, not because anyone doubted his guilt, but because of how ordinary he looked. No monster's face, no sign of torment, just a man who had worn a uniform, sworn an oath, and then lived a lie for more than half his life. After the trial, one of his former colleagues said something that stayed with the community. He was the kind of guy you trusted to back you up. Now I wonder if he was just practicing. That sentiment summed up what many felt, a deep, unsettling awareness that someone could be both protector and predator without anyone ever noticing. Today, Stephen Sanderson remains behind bars in a Michigan maximum security prison. He is an old man now, his uniform long gone, his secrets all told. Yet his story continues to haunt the people who once called him deputy. Because it wasn't just that he killed, it was that he did it while wearing the badge, while being the one everyone turned to for safety. The woods behind his old property have long since grown over. Children ride bikes on the same road where he once patrolled. But beneath that quiet surface, the memory lingers. The image of a sheriff's deputy standing under the pale Michigan moonlight, shovel in hand, burying not just a body, but the very meaning of the word trust. Which of these cases shocked you the most? For more real-life crime stories, subscribe and stay tuned for the next deep dive. Because where trust ends, the crime begins.